My paper is entitled Epigenesis and Generative Power in Descartes' Late-Scholastic Sources. And among many possible topics, I choose to deal with this one, especially in the light of the fact that one remarkable issue in Descartes' biology is how to provide an account for epigenetic embryology. Indeed, once Descartes has denied any vegetative and sensitive function of the soul, he cannot attribute to any spiritual substance the task of shaping the body in its first stages, as was thought of by contrast by a centuries-long Aristotelian, then scholastic, and Aristotelian Galenic tradition. As is known, Descartes, however, dealt with the problem in his manuscripts, where he seems to reuse within his new mechanist framework some fundamental concepts from the Galenic tradition, and especially from Galen's and Fernel's and Fabricius' embryology, notably the role attributed to innate heat and spirits in shaping the embryo. In the light of that, the purpose of my paper is that of sketching a portrait of the embryological epigenetics that Descartes could find in his contemporary scholastic sources, and especially to focus on the evaluation of Fernel's and other Galenic physicians' embryology in the scholastic debate. This is also why I will dwell especially on Descartes' recognized sources, such as the commentaries on Aristotle by Toledo, by Manuel de Gois, which is the main editor and author of most part of the volumes making up the famous Coimbra commentary on Aristotle, Suarez, Antonio Rubio, and as well as the Summe by Eustachius Sancto Paulo and Charles-François Abrat de Razoni. One noteworthy feature of these sources is that they integrate, along with the traditional authorities of the school, the medical Galenic knowledge of their time. Together with Galen, they constantly quote, especially the works of Jean Fernel, and as for the Iberian authors, especially, they quote a lot the famous Spanish physician Francisco Valles. Valles is very, 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 very influential, especially on Goes and Fonseca, and especially on Suarez, who was Spanish too. It being impossible to deal extensively with the whole of the contents of these works, I picked especially three issues, which are the nature of the semen and the action of the formative power, as well as its relationship with vital heat and temperaments, which are its instruments. The problem of the real or formal distinction between the generative, the nutritive, and the augmentative powers, and the epigenetic order of generation of the vital organs in the embryo. I wish to stress that in presenting this paper and this little inquiry, I don't want to argue any continuity between Descartes and his last scholastic contemporaries. I just want to contribute to shedding more light on Descartes' embryology and its boundaries by portraying more sharply the theories he could find in the orthodoxy of his time and in the books he has studied in La Flèche. As for the first question, as is known, Aristotle on the soul is quite vogue sources about the vegetative soul's power, which include generative powers too. However, Aristotle provides a detailed and extended discussion about the process of animal generation on generation of animals, where he assigned to the semen a strategic role in the reproduction of those animals, in which one can distinguish males and females. Aristotle held that masculine semen is the efficient cause and the principle of motion, along with essence, which is the final and formal cause, and matter, which is the material cause, and is provided by family instead. According to Aristotle, the semen is just masculine and contains the vegetative soul in potency. It's made of superfluous food and is the material vehicle by which the male introduces into the famous womb a principle of animation. Such a principle is quite an enigmatic element in Aristotle's account, but it seems to be not separable in act from matter, if not in human generation, where it, Aristotle says, contains something divine which comes from the outside. This principle is just cosmic heat, like solar heat, which somehow able to start the process of generation. In the Western tradition, another pivotal reference, which is a reference also of the Descartes Late-Scholastic sources, these authors, is of course Galen, which introduced several new elements which are very famous. And one important Galenic novelty is that about the distinction between generative and formative power. The generative power acts through heat and physical qualities and has just a segment of forming the homogeneous parts which constitute the body, so tissues, bones, cartilages, nerves, and veins. The formative power, by contrast, combines these parts to generate a whole and functional living body. Therefore, the formative power is the power which is responsible for the teleological behavior, intelligently combining the body, the teleological behavior which brings the body from a mere composition of parts to an organic whole and living whole. As known, Galen himself points out this faculty as the one revealing an intelligent cause, but it doesn't provide an explanation for it. Closer in time to the last scholastics is, of course, Fernel, which is a main authority and sources, especially, for example, for Manuel de Gois, and who re-elaborated Galen's doctrine in a quite original and very famous manner. According to Fernel, although material composition and temperaments are responsible for the formation of the fetus, they are not the causes of the integration, the unification, and the organic, holistic nature of a living body. The ultimate cause of these things, of such a holistic nature of a living body, is indeed the soul, and especially its main instruments, the spiritus, which in turn is nothing but the vehicle of the celestial heat. It's widely known that Fernel doesn't understand the spirit as Galen did, that is as a medical spirit, even if he rather tries to reconcile his account with the Galenic distinction between vital, animal, and natural spirits. For Fernel, spirit is an ethereal, tenuous substance which acts as the vehicle that transports throughout the body the celestial vital heat, which is the main thing responsible for the vegetative animation. The action of spirits is especially pivotal in generation. Spirits resides in the semen, immersed, enclosed in its matter, and from there it can finalize the entire process of generation and formation of the embryo, entering throughout the body and infusing a qualitative life into it. Fernel embodies this view within the Galenic account, arguing that while primordial elements and temperaments form the parts of the body, so once again, the tissues, and the formative power organizes them to form true organs, it's just the spirit and celestial heat that infuses the vital heat in the organism, making it an organic living whole. This picture is to allow a comparing and a more aware analysis of the doctrines one can find among the scholastics, the medieval and early modern scholastics. In the scholastic context, a very influential view is, of course, that of Aquinas, who understand the semen as a mediator in the process of generation. For Aquinas, the semen contains an active virtue derived from the soul of the generator, who is the father, which he describes as a certain movement of the soul itself, which is impressed in the semen. Such active force resides especially in the spirit, which in turn dwells in the material substratum of the semen. Once the semen encounters in the mother's womb the raw matter of the fetus, it finds already there a potential vegetative soul. The semen's active power is able to elaborate it until fully shaping the body, and in animals until causing the emergence of the sensitive soul. Aquinas' solution is very popular among Descartes' late-scholastic sources, which about these issues dwell, however, especially on two questions. The first one regards whether the semen is actually animated or living, and so if whether it already contains any soul or not. The second problem, which is much more complicated, is about the nature of the formative power and how it acts intelligently in the generation of the embryo. As for these issues, it's especially remarkable Guy's commentary on generation and corruption, as it devotes to the question a whole treatise. Here, Geuss denies that the semen is animated and accepts a Galenic distinction between two sides of the same power: a generative power, which introduces the form into matter, and the formative power, which delineates the fetus. What matters to Geuss is to establish whether the semen is able by itself to produce such teleological actions, or whether instead it has in itself a distinct organizing principle. Geuss's account is that the formative or generative power doesn't reside in the semen, but rather in the soul of the generating living being, who is the father. The father's generative power produces the semen, but it also attributes to it the power mentioned by Aquinas, namely, use Geuss's own words, another similar virtue, almost substitutive of it, which handles and shapes the fetus. For Geuss, too, this virtue represents the generating subject in the semen, and exercises heat and the vital spirit as its instruments in order to shape the body and infuse life into the new organism. To these natural elements, the ethereal heat is attached from the outside, and it bestows on these elements the capability of give birth to a new organism. But how can such a virtue know how to act, shaping the embryo proportionally and accordingly to the right measures? So here the problem is especially the problem of, the problem of the semen's heart. Why the semen's acts like an artist and knows the right proportions and measures. For Geuss, the intelligent behavior is due to the assistance of God, who even supervises the process. Actually, it's very hard, at least very hard to me, to understand if Geuss here in this passage of his commentary on generation and corruption is actually saying that God assists directly and from the outside this process, or if he's simply claiming that by contrast the God simply bestows on the semen's power the capability to do that. Geuss uses the Latin word dirigi, so God supervises the process. And it seems to me that he claims that God actually supervises from the outside the entire process. However, one similar picture can be found in the Suarez's treatise on the soul, Suarez reckons that the semen is produced by the testes, but it's obscure to him how and by whom the vital spirit is infused into it. Anyway, Suarez supports Aristotle's and Galen's idea that the semen is made up of two elements, the material and the formal, but he also argues that the semen's form even achieves the status of an animated living soul, animating living soul. The most plausible account for the problem of the infusion of the vital spirit into the semen is that it is the heart, which is traditionally associated with the vital spirits. Unfortunately, for sorry again. So Suarez subscribes the idea that the semen's form is animated. Unfortunately, for a better explanation of this doctrine, Suarez directly refers to his commentary on the physics, which is now lost. So it's quite hard to say whether Suarez thinks that the semen form is, for example, animated by virtue of the spirit itself or by another cause or not. But there is, however, another source, namely Suarez Disputation 18, which shed a little more light on his account, because Suarez here supposes that even if the semen were able by itself to shape the limbs of the body, it remains surprising how it's able to organize them into the right order and connection, which operation requires, Suarez says, another application. And this teleological behavior could be explained, Suarez says again, by another natural faculty indwelling in the mother's womb, or by the celestial influx, or by any motion or direction by the creator of nature. As for the second problem, which is the real formal distinction between the vegetative soul's power, once again, Aristotle's account is very confusing. And Aristotle characterized what has soul and life as anything that displays at least one among thinking or perception or local movement and rest, or movement in the sense of nutrition, decay, and growth, and accordingly lists five main powers of the soul, including the generation, nutrition, and augmentation, so to speak, pointing out that plants have known but the first, the nutritive, while another order of living beings has these plus the sensory and the appetitive. And therefore, nutrition, decay, and growth are the main powers of the vegetative soul, shared by all living beings. And at the same time, Aristotle maintains that reproduction is a natural scope of all living beings. So the account provided to the posterity by Aristotle is quite vogue, and especially the scholastic tradition receives the need for a quest about the nature of such power, which they could find a discussion already in Galen. Among their fundamental authorities, one finds an agreement between Galen, Albert the Great, Aquinas, and later Fernel about the fact that these powers are really distinct. So they are really distinct one each other, and there are three different powers having three different objects. This is especially a principle applied by Thomas, formulated and applied by Thomas Aquinas. About Descartes' late-scholastic sources, so that group of authors, they show, by contrast, remarkable doctrinal confusions. Sorry, I'm skipping some slides to fit the time. Okay. there is remarkable doctrinal confusion and reveal the existence of a still open debate. Despite this confusion, one could, however, try to reorder their positions, identify some common doctrinal currents organized upon their ascent to or descent from a real distinction between the vegetative powers of the soul. One first uniform lineup is that composed by Geuss, who is the forefather of this account as for the early modern authors, Antonio Rubio and Abraderazzoni. They all maintain there is no real distinction between the augmentative, the nutritive, and the generative powers. Among the physicians, this is a peculiar position of the Spanish doctor Francisco Valles, who is openly quoted and followed by Geuss and Rubio about this problem, and whose views are constantly discussed and often embraced by Suarez. Regarding Geuss, he actually doesn't identify directly the three powers, but he associates the augmentative and the nutritive powers, and only later he argues as more probable that the generative power is not really distinct from the nutritive one. In general, for the Coimbran, the fact that the three powers have three different objects is not a sufficient reason to establish a real distinction between them, although they are formally distinct as proven by their different definitions. As for the augmentative and the nutritive, Geuss denies their real distinction on the alchemist principle that there is no need to multiply the powers, especially because these two powers always act jointly. As regards, by contrast, the nutritive and the generative powers, Geuss argues instead that nutrition is nothing but partial generation, that is, the generation of specific parts of the body. Hence, it can stem from the generative power itself. Therefore, Geuss keeps the idea, which belonged already to Aquinas, of a hierarchical order of these powers, and especially the idea that the nutritive and the augmentative power, so to speak, are finalized by the work of the generative power. So they can be reduced to the generative power. Likewise, Rubio appeals to the principle of non-multiplication, Geuss, speaking of a same power provided with three different tasks. And he argues that the three powers cannot be distinguished either in themselves or by their different modus operandi. More radically, Abraderazzoni hold the same view, even denying that the three are formally distinct, and arguing that they are distinct just by reason. An alternative line, which is closer to Aquinas' original solution, but not so far from Geuss's perspective, is that supported by Francisco Toledo, Francisco Suarez, and Eustachius. The three think indeed that the generative power is really distinct from the nutritive and the augmentative power, though the nutritive and the augmentative power are not mutually distinct, if not by reason. Despite the common doctrinal perspective, I'm checking here the chat just to, okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to conclude, and I will skip the third paragraph of my presentation. There isn't a problem at all. I was saying that it's very interesting, Suarez's peculiar approach. As is known, Suarez is quite a reductionist as regards the vegetative soul's powers, nutrition and augmentation, which he reduces to the direct action of temperaments and heat. At a later time, the soul immediately unites itself to the nourishment prepared and transformed by temperaments and heat, and embraces it, making of them new parts of the holomorphic composition. For Suarez, hence, augmentative and nutritive powers are not even formally distinct, as they are just the same power seen from different points of view. On the other hand, there is an interesting question put forward by Suarez, which regards the distinction between nutritive, augmentative, and generative power. Suarez's account is quite peculiar and is influenced by, especially by Valles. Suarez approaches the issues by establishing a first distinction, that between two actions in the generation of a living being, the actions of forming the semen from the matter of blood, and the action of forming the body's limbs from the matter of the semen. In the very semen, there are in turn two different substances, the material greasy one and the spiritual substance. In the light of this distinction, the question is for Suarez threefold. It consists in establishing if the power which forms the semen in its material and greasy part is the same as the power which causes growth, so augmentation or nutrition. Consists in understanding what is the nature of the power which introduces the spirit in the semen, and which kind of power is introduced later in the semen, allowing the semen to make up the organic body. And Suarez's reply is the following. The power that materially forms the semen is nothing but the nutritive power itself, located in a specific part of the body, which is the testes, which are responsible for the generation of the semen. Secondly, the semen's power of shaping the body is a different power from the nutritive power, and the soul's power that introduces into the semen the spiritual part is not the nutritive power, again, but rather another one. So Suarez restricts the function of the nutritive power to all that is material, and simultaneously denies that the spiritual parts that one can find in the semen is, and which is responsible for the active shaping of the body, is the nutritive power. All of these actions are specific peculiarities of the generative power. Okay, I'm afraid I ran out of time, so I'll leave room for the questions. Thanks for your attention.